we got some little hats here. You can throw a keychain on them. I'll use like a little jump ring or something. So I wanted to do something to use some of my scraps up. I thought I'd also do a little free pattern set to thank everybody for hitting 100,000 subscribers. I'm just about there, should only be a couple more days, but this will be a free pattern. And these are pretty easy. Great way to use up your scraps. If you are unsure of yourself working with sheepskin, great way to give it a little test. I will say that while I was cutting, and you'll see in the beginning of the video, when you're cutting it, there's a lot of the little sheep's wool dust floating around, and a little bit of dust got on my sensor or my lens, so you'll see a little smudge. That's not your monitor, it's actually my camera. And then later in the video, while I was sewing one of these, it got just a little bit blurry. The resolution isn't super pristine. I think there's just so much fuzz collecting on the camera and stuff. But I hope you like it. Thanks again. Chances are your sheepskin's going to be thicker than you want. You could just trim it later. There's a few different ways you could do it. You could just strictly go with a pair of scissors. You could also use an attachment. The only problem with an attachment is you almost have to comb this out first before that's going to go through there well enough. Or if you trim it down with your scissors first and then finish it off with this, it's a little bit better. I usually start with scissors, finish it off with this without an attachment. This just seems to be what works best for me. I'll use the back of the scissors and lay them down on there and let the front of the scissors cut it. That way I have a little more control over the depth at this point. I usually go around the edge too, just so those long ones aren't distracting me. Probably don't need to do this step. Once I feel like it's a little more manageable, I'll come in with this. But instead of just trying to guess and hold it at a certain depth, I'll place the back of this down and just tip it to control my depth. And I'll press down a little bit, but not too hard. If you go too fast, it's not going to cut it. So go just a little bit slower. I'll try to get it close. I won't necessarily get it to the exact depth I want right now. If you get it short enough so you can work with it, that works great. And then you can just trim it later on after your little hat or whatever is put together. You can just trim around where you think it needs it, because not the whole thing is going to need to be cleaned up super nice. This will be the only pattern that will have a couple little pieces that you'll want to do out of some thin veg tan. But the rest of this and the other patterns where it's going to be sheepskin, we're going to go over that with tape to kind of give this some rigidity. So we'll go over just the sheepskin parts with some tape to make it a little easier to use this pattern. And we'll cut those out right on the line, and these will be cut out like a lot of the other patterns I do, just outside of the line, and then we'll tape these two parts to a little piece of veg tan. With these two little veg tan parts, you can cut strips the correct width and then have these templates set so you can just punch a ton of these out if you plan on making a whole bunch. Or you could just do the old school method where you're taping this straight down, and we'll cut these out after we poke some holes. Make sure it's pressed down real good. And then all I do for this is use a stitching awl. And I just make sure I'm poking through far enough, but all I use is this stitching awl here. What I like to do is just cut these out lengthwise, then use an end punch or something just to tap on the ends to clean them up. So I'll just use this little punch that I ground down. Makes those ends look real clean and nice. The sheepskin parts are going to be just a little bit different. And what I like to do for those is you can cut out little sections like I do for my large hats, but a little hole punch, like a 1/2 inch, just to get some sections out of the center. And I'll use that to tape this part down. We'll trace the outside of it. With my big hats and patterns, I'll usually do this a little bit different. Punch all these holes and then mark it with a pen. You can do that, and you can check out one of those other videos if you want to see how I do that. But since this is all scraps, I do a little bit of a different method. I'm not as worried about wasting a little bit of extra that might be on the outside. I'll start by just taping the center. And don't go over the edge yet. I like to use a heat erasable pen to trace these. That way I can just throw these in the dryer when I'm done. Don't ever throw them in there wet or with wet stuff. That'll really affect the leather. What I suggest doing, put it on your lowest setting, see how that works, and you can always turn it up just a little bit. But this white one especially doesn't really appear at first. It takes like 30 seconds for the ink kind of to start to appear. Once that ink appears, I'll just tape over the whole thing. You can just poke all these holes with an awl, but they're going to be real hard to see while you're sewing it. I like to use a 0.8 millimeter hole punch. You could go a tiny bit bigger. Just make sure to press down a little bit and get this straight. And if this is nice and sharp, it will hold on to the tape. It's not going to slide around as much on you. The needle will go through a little easier, and the holes are going to be easier to see by going with a little hole punch. Peel this tape off. If your tape's a little too sticky, you can press it against a shirt or some material to make it a little less sticky. The tape I'm using here isn't overly sticky. You can see the holes are actually pretty decent to see. I find scissors work great. You can come in with a razor blade or something to really preserve as much wool as you want. If it's where stitches are, it's not as big a deal because that seam's going to be sewn. But these edges where there's no stitches, those will be seen. So I'd be real careful and follow these instructions. That bottom part of your scissors, make sure they're slid up against underneath the skin. You don't want to just come through cutting normal. You're going to cut into a whole bunch of the wool. And little snips seem to work better than the big ones. But like I said, since this is all a stitch line, it's not as crucial for me to worry about that. Just pull some of this excess that's floating around so you don't make a huge mess while you're working on these. For the forehead part that folds up in these two ear flap sections, I like to find a denser wool area and maybe a little bit thicker skin. And same process as before. When you get to this little curve here, just press down and make sure you get into that point a little bit better so you can really see where you need to cut. The only difference with this particular part versus the other ones are these internal cut lines. And those little dots, what I like to do is that same stitching punch that I'm using, go right on that dot. It'll tell us where to start that cut, and it'll help keep it from splitting any further. You can come in with some scissors to that point. I like to start with a nice sharp blade in my utility knife. Make a couple passes if necessary. And just get those started. And I'll finish it all out with my scissors. For those little curves, I'll actually just cut straight across and trim those after this is cut out. And like I said, because that's a clean edge with no stitches, make sure you really keep those scissors up against the bottom without cutting through any wool. You can also cut this line with a utility knife. The process for this, for all the other things, is going to be the same. Have our parts here. And as far as the thread length, I'll go like 5 times the length just to be safe. I'd rather have too much than not enough. 4 might be enough. But just in case you didn't know this little trick, go through your needle and then you come back on itself and go through the thread. Try to get right through the center of it. And what that does is lock it on there, so that you're not fighting it the whole time. We'll start by going down this back seam. So you just get the wool out of the way as much as you can. Clips to help hold everything in place. And I'll take a look at the hole and make sure they kind of line up. Then when I get to the end, I will throw an extra clip past those stitches just to hold everything sandwiched together. I'll take that first clip off and tie a knot in the end of this thread here. And I make sure I have enough on the end of this because we're going to tie the two ends together when we finish up. Once you know you got a big enough knot so it's not going to pop through, we'll come from behind one of these 2 corner holes. And we'll push that thread through the bottom of this to keep it out of our way. And that's actually where we want it. We want it to be to the inside. First thing I'll do is go through that hole a second time. We're going to pull the thread straight over the top, good and snug, and then actually a third time. But this time we're going over the top of the seam to hold it nice and square. And what I look for is try to get it a 90-degree angle to those edges. So it pinches that corner just like that. Next hole, and we're just going to wrap it around and check and make sure it goes over evenly. Pull it snug. I try to leave those clips on as long as I can. They really help hold the 2 layers together. Make sure each stitch is even. When you get to that last hole, we're going to do the same thing as before, over the top and then over the back of the seam. And then just fall back over to the other side and go back up. This is where you'll want to look and make sure it crosses over the top at that same point as the previous stitch. You don't want to wrench on this, but you do want these stitches good and tight. since I have enough thread to just continue on, before I go, I'll clip this to the top of here. Helps to kind of push this in here, get it out of the way as much as possible. You can literally pick any two holes. This is completely uniform all the way around. And each hole will fall on either side of this seam. That seam goes right in between two holes, because that hole on that side of the seam will be going to that one, and this one will be going to that one. So from this, to start sewing, we'll just fall right over the top. And we're going straight over the top using that first hole, and then we'll do what we did before and wrap around here. Going to want to loosen up just a little bit more on you while sewing the top on, so it can be a good idea to throw a clip back behind there. You'll also notice when I started stitching, I went over to the top. That way this first twist of the thread pulls this seam, it almost twists it up towards the top. Otherwise it will come out and be kind of bulbous. This way it kind of helps the hat form, have a nicer shape to it. We're going to go over to that first hole we started, so it crosses over the back of that seam, and then we're going to hop right back over to this hole again. It crosses over the other side of that seam, and we'll just continue back around. Making sure that stitch is the same tension as the previous row, and we're coming across the top of that in the same spot. Because it's turned up that way, sometimes it's hard to find the hole, so I'll just come straight down, and if you just rub the needle back and forth, you'll find it. Hole we started on, instead of coming back through, I'll just go to the inside of the cap. Flip it inside out, tie a knot. I always put just a little dab of glue on my knots. You don't have to trim around here like I'm going to do. I find it looks a little bit cleaner. I do it with my big caps too usually. I'll just do this top edge first to make it a little bit easier to see what I'm doing. And then I'll round it off just a little bit. The rest of them I'll trim once I have this glued up so I can really shape it to how I like. So this edge will go right up to where those stitches are, like so. I'll get a fold kind of started, put some glue in there, and throw some clips on it. Try to stay away from the edges and coming out or up too far with the glue. You don't want it showing. Fold it right up to where those stitches are. And if I have these clips, I'll usually flip the flat side to the outside just to kind of hold it a little flatter. I don't think it really matters, but whatever. I'll wait to trim around there until that's all dry, but I'm basically straight from that edge taking off that excess. And then what I'll do is just gently round those edges off. Find a good side to look at it from. And that might be a little thick too, so I may go in and just shorten it up a little bit as well. These neat little straps, you can actually strap this down if you want it up or whatever. They will do everything a normal one of these caps will do. I'll start by coming from underneath and straight back through, and we'll tie the knot on the furry side. Well, this one, since you can see where this knot is a little better, I'll try to get a little bit of wool out of the way. Be real careful not to get glue where you don't want it, just a little teeny dab right where that knot is. You can see that looks pretty fuzzy. If you come in, follow this edge, and again you're rounding that off, then hit the rest of the forehead piece. Still looks a little bushy, and this is a good opportunity to really shape it how you want. That's why I leave it just a little bit longer than I want, because then you can really refine the look of these. And even across the fold. You can kind of pull out to see where you might need to trim a little more. And there's a little trapper or a Ushanka hat. Ushanka? I don't know how to pronounce it. But you can fold these back and go behind here like that style, or fold it up and go over the top of the head. I just sew where I want it to stay. Getting your sheepskin and all your parts ready to go is going to be exactly the same process for these other hats. Technically, you only need to cut one out and just reuse it if you want to make a more reusable template. But I do have the 4 in there just to make it easier to piece out and make sure you get them where you want them on your sheepskin. The only thing I suggest is making sure these edges are a little bit thicker. They have enough wool so when you fold it up, that band will look nice. Let's take 2 parts. We're going to start on the tips where it's sewn. These open ends will always be facing down. Just take a look across and make sure the holes are lined up before you start clipping. This one is a little different, you'll see why here. But same as before, I'm coming up from underneath inside of the hat. And once I come out, grab a little clip just to sandwich those 2 parts together, make it a little easier. Now the difference between this is that peak of the hat. We're not going to be going over the top of this seam, only across it. So my first stitch is going to go straight over the top, nice and tight. And then from there, we're going to just start going down right away. Make sure those stitches are coming across the top cleanly and lined up, spaced right. Where we end on that open end with no stitches, this is where we're going to do over the top and then over the end of the seam. Straight over the top, through again. And whenever we do these seams, I'm looking at that 90-degree angle, trying to get this one over the straight, that one over that straight. And pinch that corner together. We'll just continue back. Just remember this top part where all of them are going to peek together, we're not going over the ends of the seams. On the way back, make sure you're pulling about the same tension and that it crosses over the top at the same point. We'll go through the last hole this time. We're not going to go over the top, and the reason for that is it'll look real nice and have that little peak on top. Now we're just going to, the side that this thread is on, we're going to clip the next piece. Right from the get-go, we're just going to go right straight over the top. And then all the way down. And just to reiterate what we do when we get to the last hole on that straight side, second time through, to go straight over the top. Make sure it goes straight over the top. And then this third time we're going to go over the back. And I'm looking at that 90-degree, trying to get it nice on that corner. And follow it back. We're going to stop one hole short from that corner before we hop over. But first we'll clip this last part on, and you would think this side would be correct, but I find, obviously you can do it however you like, but I find popping it over to this side, that way I can come through that hole and just pop over there. I'm just trying not to have too many stitches hopping over everywhere constantly. It can get a little crazy, but however you want to do it. So now to finish that last hole, we would hop over and come straight through, but instead of coming through on that side, we go straight across. Actually, there's a lot of wool in the way here. You don't want too much of that getting up in there. So I'll be coming around to the last hole, but instead of coming out this side, I'll go straight across and come out on that new piece. And that's going to want to come apart, so I'm going to put a clip right there. And I'll go straight over the top and go down that whole side. Again, I'm stopping one hole short of the end, and I'll clip these other two parts together to finish up the hat. So when I come around that last hole, I do that same thing again and go straight across instead of coming out that same side. I'll just go straight over the top and work up my way down. Make sure when you get to this end that you go over the end of the seam. I almost ran out of thread here, but I think I'll be able to make it work. That's why I think 5 times the length is probably better than the 4. Maybe even more than that. I'd rather have too much than not enough, like I say. But when I go through this last hole here, that's when I'll just go back to the inside of the cap. And I'll tie those two ends together. That way you don't get all those extra knots or anything on top. It looks pretty clean. Be careful not to stretch this outer part. Be gentle when you push it back through. What we want, and you can see very slightly starts to come in at the end. And you can come in and stretch the top of it out, but I'm really bringing my fingers across so that I'm not stretching this out at all. That way it holds nice and close. That fold's going to go up about there, not a whole lot. Figure out where that fold needs to be. And really press, especially on those seams. What I like to use is a golf ball to put in there. Kind of stretch it out, especially while the glue dries. It really helps it hold its shape. You can see, you get that in there. And you can hold it and do one at a time. Put a little glue in there. Or unfold it, put a little glue and fold it back up. You can tap it with a little mallet or something, especially while it's on here. Put a little glue in there. You can use clips. I really do like to use that golf ball. And you can put the golf ball on there and wrap something around it just to hold it down tighter if you want. This one I didn't do that. I just put some glue in there, stuff that in there and let it dry. That might be a little too much. You don't want it oozing out. Just a little bit of a fold. There's not a whole lot there. So I'll feel and make sure it's uniform all the way around. And take a look at the hat. And then this one I didn't trim the fuzz on it at all. May not do this one either. Unless you get some real scraggly ones, it might be good just to tap them. But I like leaving that edge a little rougher. If you round it off, then you're seeing that. So whenever it's folded back, I'll leave it alone. And one thing I will mention, if you put a lot of glue on there and then you put the clips on and just let it sit like overnight, that glue soaks in quite a bit. So don't go too heavy on the glue and don't leave these clips on for too long. I just pulled this off and I think I'll be just fine. But I thought I would mention that. So the last one, we'll do this bucket hat, and it can be glued or sewn up to be a little cowboy hat. Same as before. Tie a good size knot with enough excess on the end. We'll start by doing these two edges here. Coming in like before, the inside of the cap. This one, both ends will go over the top and around the outside of the seam. If your seam's open up, or if you got a lot of fuzzies coming up, one thing to keep in mind is not put your needle through and then find up to the hole. If you come through it and then go down, kind of push those fuzz out of the way, it can help a little bit. So this one will just go straight over the top, then we'll go over the outside. Pinch those together to make sure you get that 90-degree across the corner. Pull snug. Same thing on this side. We're going to go straight over the top and then around the outside of the seam. Then we'll put the brim on. So with this one, I'll stretch. Be careful, you'll feel that there might be a spot where you could actually rip it, especially if this is thinner skin. We're stretching this out, not the whole thing, just around where the stitches are to try to get it to splay out just a little bit. It'll make it easier to get all these holes lined up. That side's not as important as doing it to this side, and this side will rip easier even, because it's a lot easier to really wrench on it. Just a little bit of a stretch to try to open that up. And I'm just looking at the holes straight across, trying to keep them lined up as best I can. Another thing that can make it a little easier on you is don't put these clips back too far. If you just get just enough of it to hold on to it, you won't be fighting it nearly as much. Just make sure you use something if you need to get some of that wool out of the way. And I'm just looking at these holes, and you can see I need to kind of pull this one back to get it to line up. I have this hole representing that one here for that side of the seam. So we'll just fall over to this side first off. Let's work our way around. Try your best to get these two sides pinched together. Once you get to the other side, I'm going to go through to go straight over, but I'm going to hop over to this other side. And then I'm going to go straight over that one and hop back to the other side of the seam again. It really holds that all together. And now we can go right back, and it'll cross over each one of those old stitches. Going back's a lot easier than coming around the first time. I try not to pull the stitches too super tight on this. I don't want to shrink that down too much. It's easy to overdo it. When you come all the way back around, instead of coming out, we'll just go down through here and tie a knot with that one that's already in there. Since this could show a little, I will get rid of some of that stuff that's going to be underneath the thread. Try to make sure that knot gets down in there a little more. It's a good idea to kind of stretch, set those stitches in there a little bit. Don't overly do it. And last but not least, we're going to put the top on here. With this clipped, I'll just come up from in here, but I'm going to hit one of these holes. I don't want to come out of the top because then I'll be going around this way and it'll pull that seam and twist it this way. I want it to twist up to make that top a little smaller, and it domes this very nice. So I'll come up, kind of move some of the wool out of the way and feel, and come out that hole right there. And go straight across. And then you'll always be going through the top. If you're coming from the side, go back and fix that. So now that I got to the last hole, make sure it's tight. I'll go into that last hole, but just come right back out it, go straight over the top again, just like I did on that side. And then continue all the way back. You'll notice as you're sewing these that because of the twist and the pull, it's actually at a little bit of an angle back almost to get through that hole. And same as always, that's the last hole. So we'll go right back into the hat. I find it's easier if it's just inside out. I like to stretch it out a little again. Not going very hard, just giving it a good stretch. I mean, technically you can just leave the wool like that. Your other option is to trim it like before when I do that. Just straight down from that edge, a 90-degree angle. It's a little thick. You can thin it down before you round that corner off. Just to make it more uniform. But you'll come in at a little bit of an angle. Just nick that corner down. If you want to make this into a little cowboy hat, you can fold those up, sew them, and glue them down. I usually try to get that bottom seam up a little bit so that that's right in line with those stitches there. Don't go overboard. It can soak through. Don't go quite to the top where it'll go on either side. Make sure that seam is right to the back. These clips work, but I do prefer for this one to use clothespins. Little sheepskin cowboy hat.